Forest spirits. The bus left Hendersonville at 20 minutes before 7. Alex Savin exited the depot calmly, checked his mirrors left, center, right, and merged onto Route 221 North. The radio crackled briefly before shutting off. Outside, daylight slowly faded over the western ridge, leaving a faint orange strip along the trees. By town's edge, darkness had settled. Having driven this route over 200 times, he knew every turn, straightaway, and switchback, requiring early braking to avoid drift. He knew the mountain's October sent wet bark, cold stones, faintly sweet dying leaves. He recognized it instinctively, like an old piece of furniture, feel and reach. Tonight, 11 passengers boarded, he counted out of habit. A woman and small boy pressed their faces to the window, fogging the glass. A large man in a sport coat asked twice about arrival time before departure. Some passengers he recognized from before, but lacked names. In the third row from the back, an elderly woman in a gray coat sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. The rain began around mile 12, light and steady, darkening the road and scattering headlights. Alex slowed by 5 miles per hour, keeping both hands on the wheel. The wipers moved rhythmically as the rain blurred the view, and the road ahead appeared as a pale ribbon fading into darkness. He was watching the shoulder when he first saw something that made him instinctively ease off the gas. A reaction, something that occurs before the mind responds. 30 yards ahead on the uphill side, the embankment looked different. The grass was crushed not by rain. Gravel at the base was displaced outward, as if something had recently broken through from above. He slowed 5 miles an hour. Behind him, the man in the sport coat Karlov, as Alex saw on the roster, shifted and called out over the engine noise. "Driver, we'll be late if you keep slowing down." Alex hesitated, watching the shoulder. Past a mashed grass patch and a dark stain on the asphalt, probably something heavy, he spoke. "Sir, there's weather on the pass." His tone was flat, focused, as always. "There's weather everywhere. We won't crawl." In the third row, little Danny, his mother had called him, made a small unhappy sound and pressed closer. She whispered something too quiet for Alex to hear. The bus reeked of damp coats and faint coffee scent. Alex kept his eyes on the road. 8 years ago, he was fired for stopping a route without permission, an almost identical night with rain, mountain roads, and an uneasy feeling in his hands. He pulled over, refused to move for 40 minutes, and when the slide finally occurred, it destroyed a 50-foot section of road 2 miles ahead. The company responded by ending his contract, citing his delay and failure to follow procedures. Survival seemed irrelevant. He eventually found work again with a different company on the same road. Sometimes he thought about this, especially when the mountains seemed different and the ground felt like it was waiting to shift. He told himself he knew nothing yet. Drive, the pass was 6 miles ahead, where the road would narrow, hugging the cliff face on the left and dropping to a long fall on the right. No guardrail there. The county planned to install one for 3 years. Alex knew this spot well. It was where he had once measured from the shoulder during daylight, gazing down through the trees at the creek bed 200 feet below. The wipers kept their rhythm as the rain intensified. Behind him, Danny stopped fussing, pressing his cheek to the window, watching the dark pass by. His wide, steady eyes showed innocence, observing something unfamiliar but not frightened. Alex glanced at the road, noting the embankment on the right, covered in rhododendron and pine. Headlights illuminated birch trunks, and the trees appeared pale blue against darkness. The road was firm but damp and growing wetter. At mile 23, his right front wheel dipped slightly, causing the bus to lurch right before he corrected it. He gently braked, stopped the vehicle, and kept the engine idling. The cabin fell silent. Through the windshield, he saw the shoulder had vanished on the passenger side. The embankment had silently collapsed as they drove, leaving the edge over open air. The silence inside the bus lasted 3 or 4 seconds before everyone started talking simultaneously. Karlov's voice was the loudest, while the woman with Danny made a short, frightened noise. Someone in the back asked what happened. Another said, "Oh God," and the woman in the gray coat, the same who had sat silently with folded hands since Hendersonville, said nothing. Alex took out his phone, checked the signal, 1 bar, then none. He lifted it toward the windshield, no signal. He lowered the phone and gazed out his window. To his right, a dark mountain edge, no railing or shoulder, just air and distant water sounds. To his left, the dense forest wall pressing close, trees crowding the road as if waiting. He turned off interior lights to save power, turning on emergency flashers. The red flash pulsed on the wet road like a heartbeat. 11 people, he thought. No signal, no shoulder, no way ahead. He paused with both hands on the wheel like he always did when nothing else remained but to think. Everyone else waited for him to decide. He wasn't sure he knew. The bus's noise thickened with the smell of wet fabric, voices overlapping like waves. Alex kept his hands on the wheel, not because the bus moved, but to avoid admitting he had lost control and needed a few more seconds of illusion before facing them. He turned off the engine and listened, the sudden silence sharpening every sound, a drip near the axle, a faint rattle above, and rain tapping the metal and glass, like fingers measuring a limit he sensed but couldn't see. "Everybody stay seated," he said, his voice carrying farther than he expected, silencing fractured conversations. One by one, they looked up, eyes catching the dim yellow lights, faces pale and strained, as if the road had aged more than the miles. Karlov was the first to rise, bracing a hand on the seat behind him and stepping into the aisle. His jaw was clenched, raincoat open over an expensive-looking sport coat, his phone still in hand, dark and useless. "You can't just sit there," he said, with enough force that the woman with headphones flinched and pulled off an earpiece, becoming suddenly aware of their precarious position. "We're over a hole, and you're telling us to stay seated." Alex looked at the warning lights on the panel, which meant little without the engine running, then back at the window where the right headlight revealed torn earth and raw roots beyond the missing shoulder. The bus seemed stable, slightly tilted toward the abyss with most weight on the solid ground, but the way it settled warned him the surface wasn't reliable. "I'm going outside to assess the damage," he said, unbuckling his seat belt with a calmness that belied his nervous stomach. "Everyone stay on board until I say otherwise." Moving all at once could shift the weight dangerously. The words had their intended effect. People froze, as if suddenly recognizing their own weight as having mass, and even Karlov's grip on the seat in front tightened, as he imagined the bus tipping into darkness for a wrong step. The old woman in the gray coat, her name unclear, sat as since the start, hands on her purse, eyes on the floor, her attention signaled only by a slight tilt of her head toward his voice. Alex retrieved the small flashlight from the overhead bin, tested it against his palm, and moved down the narrow stairs to the front door, feeling the bus shift subtly, as his weight shifted forward just enough to remind him that here, everything depended on inches and balance, and on how many mistakes had been made on this mountain in the last rainy week. The door opened with its usual reluctant sigh, a sound he'd heard thousands of times, yet tonight it seemed edged with discontent, as if the bus itself resented releasing him. The first breath of air was colder than expected, sharp, damp, carrying smells of wet leaves, clay, and a metallic hint from exposed rebar in the crumbling roadbed. He paused on the threshold, listening to the night, the steady rain, the distant rush of water from the creek, and the ravine below louder than it should have been at this distance, indicating the runoff from the slopes was already swelling it. No engine noise above or below, no distant headlights or dull hum of vehicles crossing a bridge down the valley, just the mountain breathing slowly in the dark. He stepped onto the narrow asphalt strip in front of the bus, directing the flashlight along the right side, careful to stay inside the faded white line marking the lane's edge. The beam revealed jagged shapes and slick surfaces, glints of water and broken stone. The shoulder vanished halfway along the bus, where the asphalt had cleanly sheared away, exposing gravel, compacted fill, and beneath that, raw clay that the road had barely pressed against. The front right tire was half in the void, its lower part hidden by spilled soil that reached the treetops below, mud engulfing it to the rim. He observed water seeping through the torn slope, forming rivulets that would widen with rain, threatening to loosen more hillside. Walking the bus length with the beam, he found the rear wheels still held, though not securely. The asphalt beneath them was dark, slightly domed, as if beginning to sag where the soil shifted beneath. He crouched, ignoring the cold water soaking his knees, and pressed a hand against the ground near the tire, feeling for vibrations that might signal the slope was still shifting. All he sensed was the pounding of blood in his fingertips. On the bus's left side, the mountainside loomed close, a steep wall of rock and dirt just a few steps from the wheels, water droplets clinging to the exposed strata. Small stones occasionally broke loose and clicked down, a reminder that the hill above was unstable. At the top, faintly visible in his light, roots protruded from the earth, some already loose, as if the trees were slowly unfastening from the mountain. He shut off the flashlight briefly, trying to adjust to darkness, but saw little beyond the road winding ahead and vanishing behind the hillside. Without artificial light, the night felt heavier, as if it had filled the space the headlamps had pushed back. For the first time since driving, he felt the road was observing him not mystically, but with the impersonal patience of something capable of swallowing better men. He turned on the beam again and walked a few yards past the bus, enough to see where fractured asphalt met intact pavement, a jagged edge, like a broken tooth protruding into space. The slide with the shoulder hadn't yet crossed the lane, but the collapse undercut its outer edge, leaving a narrow asphalt arch with nothing below. It looked solid until viewed underneath, revealing the hollow. He imagined 11 people standing, grabbing bags, shifting, stumbling, misplacing weight, and the moment when the arch would give way, the sudden tilt, and the sound of the bus tearing free. Returning inside, he was hit by the cabin's warmth and closeness, tinged with anxiety. Conversations resumed at his face, as if each held a question triggered by his presence. "Well," Karlov said, standing in the aisle, shoulders squared, eyes angry but recent with fear. "We must move this before more of the road vanishes. If we can't drive out, we push, unload, or do something. Don't just sit here waiting for the mountain to fall." At the back, Danny had finally fallen asleep with his head in his mother's lap, his sneakered feet sticking out at an odd angle. One sock slipping down his ankle, damp hair plastered to his forehead. Marina Alex didn't know her name, yet kept one arm around him, and the other braced on the armrest, ready to stand and shield him from unseen danger. Old Ruth, in a gray coat buttoned to the throat, opened her purse and took out a battered thermos, which looked like it had traveled mountain passes longer than most passengers had lived. Without a word, she poured steaming tea into a plastic cap and handed it to the woman next to her, who accepted it with a shaky automatic gratitude, as if given a life preserver just before drowning. The right front wheel is buried in mud where the shoulder used to be, Alex said, taking a half-filled breath and exhaling slowly as he watched their expressions change. "The ground beneath us is saturated and still settling. If we all get out and push, we risk increasing the load on the weakest side, causing the whole thing to give way. We stay put for now." Karlov stepped closer, the bus shifting subtly under the redistributed weight, prompting some to grip their armrests instinctively. "For now," he repeated, voice tense. "But what if for now turns into the bus is sliding, and we're still here because you refuse to act to avoid trouble with your dispatcher?" Alex met his gaze, momentarily seeing not the man before him, but his former supervisor from 8 years ago, in a fluorescent corridor, explaining that good intentions don't shield from company policy. The memory flickered and faded, leaving a bitter aftertaste. "My dispatcher isn't here," he said, surprised by the sharpness in his own voice, a roughness that hadn't been there at the start. "The mountain is, the bus is, that's what I see." Marina then spoke softly, her voice cutting through Karlov's, possibly because she held Danny tighter. If the ground keeps shaking while we sit here, she said, looking at Alex, not Karlov, what will happen to us and him if we wait too long? Are we safer inside or on the road? Her question balanced the tension, and he sensed the other passengers' attention shift slightly, as if they leaned forward in hopes he had an answer he hadn't voiced yet. He reflected on the road ahead, noting that the nearest town, just a cluster of lights he'd passed countless times, was miles beyond the pass. To reach it on foot, they'd have to walk along the narrow asphalt strip with a ravine on one side and an unstable hillside on the other in rain and darkness. They had a child, an old woman, and at least one injured man from their earlier attempt to push the bus. He considered leaving them here alone with the bus as a dim yellow capsule at the edge of the world, while he searched through the forest for help, trusting the mountain to stay still. He remembered feeling the subtle give of the ground near the rear tires as he knelt in the rain. "We're safer inside for the next hour," he said, feeling the words settle like a heavy piece clicking into place. After that, if rain and ground conditions change, it might not be true anymore. Karlov responded with almost desperate sarcasm, a man who needed control through anger. "So what do you suggest? You stay here and check the ground like a doctor monitoring a pulse while we trust you won't miss when to run." Alex stared out the window at the dense forest where trees pressed close, branches swaying in the rain, their reflections flickering in the glass. The slope beyond was black, obscuring his vision. "We wait," he said, his tone metallic like he hated it, as did Karlov. "I'll check the ground every 15 minutes. If I see signs the bus shifts, we start moving people off, lightest first, uphill, then decide whether to go through the pass or head back on foot. Right now, stepping into that rain on a narrow shoulderless road at night near the drop is riskier than staying here." They exchanged looks, fear and reason battling, yielding only reluctant acceptance. Even Karlov's shoulders dropped slightly, his jaw relaxing as he realized there were no easy answers or safe solutions. Alex sank into the driver's seat, unable to stand in the aisle without blocking it, the worn chair molded to him over years, feeling suddenly unfamiliar a place where he was supposed to be confident. Yet he was simply piecing together a plan from experience, fear, and fragile hope that the mountain would buy him time. He glanced at the reflection of the cabin in the wide mirror above the windshield, at the faces turned toward him, some openly, others in sideways glances, each with its own private question. He thought of his daughter at home, about the plate she'd set for dinner absent-mindedly, trusting he'd be on time, which he usually was, and the silent phone in the tiny kitchen. No ring because there was no signal beyond the pass. The bus creaked softly like metal cooling or the chassis settling into the soft ground, and a few flinched as if struck from behind. Old Ruth lifted the thermos again, poured more tea silently, then snapped the cup back with quiet finality, making the small sounds seem louder. "Someone is going to have to go," she said softly, without naming anyone, letting the words hang where everyone could hear. The bus fell silent after that, the idea of departure suddenly solid among them, and every lingering gaze flicking from window to floor to seat back turned in the same direction, as if a string had been pulled. They looked at Alex, who sat long enough for their gaze to shift from pressure to gravity, weighing him down and making breath harder. After Old Ruth's simple statement, the bus fell silent. Each person's unspoken questions filled the quiet, reflecting on the road, rain, lack of signal, and their own capabilities. They faced a tough choice: stay in the bus, risking a slide into the ravine, or step out into the mountain night, which could swallow them in different ways. He could wait for someone else to volunteer, perhaps a younger man who had already struggled with mud and shame, but he knew they weren't seeking a random or brave act. They believed he carried the responsibility for their fate. With a tired clarity, he realized he'd been waiting for this moment since mile 12, when he first noticed the embankment looking wrong. "I'll go," he said humbly. The words felt inevitable, like a pressure valve releasing after hours. As soon as he spoke, the bus seemed to exhale with him, fabric rustling, feet shifting, shoulders relaxing or tightening slightly. Karlov opened his mouth to protest or make his case, but hesitated when he saw a shadow flicker on the window of branch, moving, reminding him the mountain outside didn't care about their plans or regulations. Marina's hand tightened on Danny's shoulder, still asleep and unaware of the change in the air, and she looked at Alex with a strained expression, fear hollowing her cheeks and sharpening her bones beneath the dim cabin lights. "How far is it?" she asked. The answer was complex because in this weather and darkness, distance wasn't measured in miles, but by the number of uncertain decisions made without knowing if they'd be right. 5 miles if I go through the woods, he said, estimating slightly lower as if reducing the distance might ease her fear. Maybe 8 or 9 along the road, but the pass ahead is worse and steeper, so I won't take the asphalt unless necessary. She swallowed hard, then nodded slowly, as if signing an unspoken agreement that acknowledged the risk she accepted because she had no choice. "Will you come back?" she asked simply, without blame, trusting that when someone said they'd return, they usually did. He considered lying to ease her pain, but the mountain had already stripped away illusions tonight, and he didn't want to add another fragile layer that could break. Instead, he said, "I'm going to try," maintaining eye contact to show her the uncertainty, not to frighten her more, but because experience taught him people handle fear better than betrayal. Nothing wounds more than a broken promise in a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. He stood, feeling stiff from kneeling on the wet asphalt, and reached into the overhead compartment for his jacket, still dry because he hadn't needed it earlier. The lining felt cold, as if it sensed the coming night. From where he sat, arguing fiercely just 15 minutes ago, Karlov surprisingly shrugged out of his heavier coat a dark, costly quilted piece and stepped into the aisle, holding it out. His face was strangely blank, like a man who had shifted plans so quickly his features hadn't caught up. He said, sounding strained, "Take this, yours is too thin for rain, and if you freeze out there, we all have a problem." Alex hesitated, instinctively refusing to seem indebted beyond the job, but the cold wind and mountain air made him accept the coat with a brief nod. The warmth settled around him like borrowed armor. "Thank you," he said softly, creating a small but meaningful connection that made Karlov look away, uncomfortable, as if he saw himself in a mirror he disliked. He checked his phone out of habit battery at 34%, reception bars knocked out like teeth, and put it in his pocket, knowing even one bar on a ridge could mean the difference between silence and a broken call. He grabbed his worn folding knife, kept in the glove box, and slipped it into Karlov's coat pocket, not for fighting, but because holding steel made the uncertain feel a little less indifferent. Danny stirred as he passed, one small sneaker shifting, toes brushing the aisle, while Marina bent to smooth the boy's hair, her fingers gentle and automatic, then looked up again. "If something happens here," she said, voice trembling on the first word, "if the ground starts to move again, what do we do?" "You listen to the hill," he replied, surprised at himself for wording it that way, as if recalling his father's description of how a slope speaks before it shifts and groans, rustles, and tiny stony sighs. "If you notice a shift or hear sounds beyond wind or rain, move to the uphill side quickly, one person at a time, avoiding the right windows. Stay calm." He knew telling people not to panic was like asking rain not to fall, but sometimes saying it bought a few seconds for them to realize they still had options and how to respond, even if the larger threat was out of control. He moved to the bus front, feeling everyone's eyes in the mirror, and paused, hand on the step rail, sensing the subtle sway of the vehicle, the faint creak of the frame when someone shifted, the rustle of clothing, and a quiet throat clear. Beneath all the noise, the bus had a presence of machine that had transported thousands of lives, now stranded like a wounded animal with a caught leg, awaiting mercy. At the back, old Ruth raised her head and looked directly at him for the first time that night, her eyes surprisingly bright amid her lined face. He briefly thought she might bless or warn him, words rooted in mountain churches or whispered in kitchens, but she only nodded slightly, acknowledging the moment, and that there was nothing left but to endure. He stepped into the stairwell, pressed the button, and felt cold, damp air rush in, carrying the scent of hours of rain soaking everything soil, rock, bark, transforming the forest into a sponge that squeezed water with each movement. The first step on the asphalt felt different from his earlier check, not because the road changed, but because he now understood he was leaving the bus's safe, lit interior to step into darkness without walls, handrails, or lights. The rain pelted his face like icy needles, driven by a strengthening wind, and he pulled Karlov's coat tighter, grateful for the thick fabric that kept most of the water away, even as dampness seeped into the air, soaking his hair and sliding down his neck. He took 3 cautious steps along the bus and paused, glancing at the tree's uphill dark, clustered trunks and heavy wet leaves gleaming faintly in the headlights' glow. Beyond them, the train rose, dropped, and twisted in ways he knew only from maps and fleeting glimpses through the windshield, attempting to imagine the ridges and hollows hidden beneath the darkness. The road disappeared around the mountain's shoulder, a pale, slick curve fading into shadow where the headlamps couldn't reach. Walking along it, close to the edge of the drop, felt like risking falling off a dam in flood. The woods, offering cover and options, also held hidden dangers, gullies, roots to trip over, and the confusing sameness of trees that blurred the sense of direction. He shone his flashlight into the forest, glimpsing a faint path or old track, a thin break in the undergrowth, with disturbed leaves and scattered animal prints in the wet soil. It wasn't much, but it was enough, and he moved toward it instinctively. Pausing at the tree line, he turned back to the bus one last time. From here, with dimmed interior lights and flashing emergency signals on its wet metal, it looked less like a bus and more like a fragile bubble of human life trapped in an unwanted place. Inside, faint warm glow and nervous movements cast vague silhouettes. Marina leaning over Danny, Karlov near the front, one hand on a seat back, the other likely still on his phone, thumb rubbing the useless screen. Old Ruth's gray coat was barely visible near the rear, still as stone. He raised a hand, a small acknowledgement to them and the bus, then turned toward the trees, feeling the boundary between asphalt and soil beneath his boots. The ground here was softer, less predictable, wet leaves slipping, twigs snapping, mud giving way with slow tugging motions, and rain's sound shifting from a salt to a constant susurration through the canopy, dripping from branches. He moved slowly, carefully finding the faint path with his boots rather than trusting his eyes, which struggled with shadows and his fading flashlight's narrow beam. Every swing of the light revealed whetstones, roots, and discarded cans, evidence others had traveled this route during daylight, perhaps toward a fishing spot or hunt. Behind him, the bus's headlights cast a long, spindly shadow, making him appear fragile and stretched, a figure slipping into the unknown. Briefly, he thought of how this looked from inside, the steady driver shrinking into a dark silhouette among the trees. After about 20 steps, he instinctively looked back only to see the bus's glow fade behind the trunks and branches, leaving a faint glow like a lantern hung far back. He felt a sharp, brief twist in his chest, neither regret nor fear, but a mix of both, and realized, more deeply than words could express, that he had crossed a point of no return. He paused and listened, holding his breath as the night sounds settled around him. The steady rain now softer, the distant creek rushing below, water dripping from branches, trees shifting under their wet weight, and beneath it, a thick, expectant quiet that was less absence than presence, making his hair stand on end. It felt less like silence and more like something subtly waiting, unseen yet aware, like the forest had registered his arrival, much like a house senses footsteps through its floors. Adjusting his wrist strap flashlight, checking that his knife hadn't shifted, he took another step forward. The forest seemed to close in with each pace, the bus behind him receding not just in distance, but as a mental anchor, a place to return to. He told himself it would still be there because the alternative was unthinkable, but with each step, the world around him shrank to the circle of light at his feet, his breathing and the relentless darkness pressing in on all sides. He initially made each step deliberate, placing his boots on faint trails, keeping his body slightly downhill, guiding himself toward the valley where pine woods sat, marked by a few streets, a volunteer fire station, and, more importantly, old men with trucks and tractors, driven by duty beyond approval. As long as he maintained that mental image, the forest became a series of obstacles, rather than an overwhelming threat. The ground beneath him shifted unpredictably, with small ridges rising and falling, shallow dips hidden by leaves turning into slick hollows filled with water, causing unexpected weight shifts and quick pain through his ankles and knees. The rain, no longer pounding, dripped constantly through the canopy, soaking his collar, cuffs, and spine, leaving no part of him dry. In such discomfort, it would have been easy to focus solely on each step, keeping the flashlight steady and avoiding falls, but he knew that losing track of the landscape shapes and slopes would let the forest fold around him, erasing his sense of direction. So he paid attention to his calves' angles, how his thighs burned more when crossing uphill short rises, and how his breathing changed with the slope's demands. To his right, hidden among trunks and branches, he still heard the creak, the deeper, steadier rumble that grew louder when he descended and softened when ascending, and he consciously kept it in his awareness, not close, but as a marker of safe territory like an old trail guide. As long as the water stayed roughly where he expected, he could mentally match his map to the real mountain. He thought of his father, not abstractly but recalling scenes his dad in their Oregon rental's backyard, drawing a rough cross-section of a hill in cracked concrete with chalk, explaining how, in bad weather, water's behavior was more reliable than the landscape's straight lines, since water always flowed downhill into valleys, connecting him to roads and people. Fear, he'd said, could twist paths into circles. Feet don't lie, his father had added, tapping the chalk at the steepest slope, dusting his work boots, smelling of coffee and cheap spearmint gum. Trust what they tell you about up and down, that's what matters. Now, with his flashlight's beam flattening roots and rocks into shades of gray and black, and the trees forming a pattern with no clear landmarks, he finally understood how easily one could lose track of direction, how quickly I'm going. This way could become, I don't know where I am, especially when only the sound of his breath and his heartbeat echoed around him. The trail he followed split sooner than expected into two shallow angled paths, both heading downhill, covered in wet leaves and shiny roots, framed by closely spaced trees. He paused at the junction, shining his flashlight along each branch, seeking a clue to the better choice, maybe disturbed soil or a boot print softened by rain, but the forest blurred such markers. The right branch was wider, less shrub-covered, and showed signs of frequent use, with a faint worn gutter in the mud from repeated footsteps. The left was narrower, with a fresh strip of flattened grass, indicating recent passage by heavier than usual travelers, its footprints partially washed away by rain. Shadows and rain created circles on the soil, erasing tracks quickly, and a sense grew that the mountain was actively clearing the path of evidence, as if aiming to hide any recent visitors from future travelers. His logical mind favored the wider route, since it appeared more traveled, more likely to lead somewhere safe, while another part remembered stories of hidden paths and faint animal tracks, hinting the narrower way might be more direct. He lingered, feeling rain seep into his shirt and Karlov's coat, the drenching increasing despite the fabric's resistance. The nearby bus lights pressed into the darkness, emphasizing the passing of time, each moment of hesitation risking further erosion of the bank and shoulder or forcing the mountain to shift the path. Ultimately, he took the wider trail, convincing himself it was smarter not to chase uncertain shortcuts or secret knowledge, especially when already considering probabilities. As he stepped onto the right path, he felt a twinge of regret for the unseen narrower route, as if a different version of him was heading a different way toward another fate. The initial few steps felt reassuring. The trail continued downhill. The creek sound grew clearer, and the slope matched his expectations, a steady descent toward a valley, with hopes of reaching fields and distant houses beyond. He envisioned the moment he'd step from the trees into a clearing, where porch lights and distant buildings would glow a bright point of hope that warmed him more than Karlov's coat. He walked on, losing track of time as focus narrowed to avoiding holes, twisting ankles, and keeping the flashlight beam steady. Gradually, the creek's steady roar faded and shifted away, as if he was moving along a gentle arc rather than straight, and the valley floor was no longer beneath him. He paused, breathing deeply from tension, then turned his head slowly, listening as his father had taught him, trying to make sense of layered forest sounds. The rain had softened to mist, whispers rather than drums, and the creek's voice seemed to come from multiple directions, bouncing off unseen rocks, and trees making the sound follow him disorientingly. An uneasy warmth knotted in his stomach, recalling stories of wandering in circles in the woods, where the absence of horizons and the repetitive nearby objects scrambled the sense of direction, causing the brain to invent patterns. He opened his eyes, looking at the path ahead and behind. They appeared so similar he nearly lost his sense of which way led to the bus. He pulled out his phone to check the time, partly to ease panic and partly to ground himself. It was 11:04 p.m. The barely visible battery icon showed 21%, a quiet reminder of how little power remained. He believed he had walked about 40 minutes since leaving the road, accounting for stops, covering roughly a mile or two, but the forest's immense scale distorted time and distance. His legs felt burdened as if carrying the weight of every decision, not just the effort of walking. He slowly turned in a full circle, the flashlight's thin beam illuminating trunks, undergrowth, and damp patches of ground. When the circle repeated, he was struck by a cold recognition unrelated to whether a cluster of objects at the tree's base he had seen earlier, a skewed sapling, a slightly lighter flat rock, and a rusted can tied with twine to a low branch. He had initially noticed the can as a mere marker, left by hunters or teens, a sign of human presence he had barely acknowledged. Seeing it again now, in what felt like a different spot but was likely the same, caused a sudden disorienting sense of unreality, as if the ground shifted beneath him. He stepped closer, carefully lifting the can and feeling the rough wet metal against his fingers. The frayed twine was intact, fibers splayed like old rope, and near the knot, a faint streak of blue paint he previously ignored. It was more than just another can. It was the can. Deep inside, a cold voice warned, "You've circled back, burned time and energy on a loop." And behind that, a darker guttural thought emerged, panic, not loud and frantic, but quiet and tightening, making him doubt his previous choices. He forced himself to stand still, feeling the coat's weight, the damp bark under his hand, and the rapid heartbeat that seemed too intense given his effort. Then he remembered his father's words, getting lost is mainly about speed. His father had said this casually during a wrong turn at a campground, hinting that rushing prevents the brain from mapping correctly, causing knots. Stop early, untangle easier. So he halted. He turned off the flashlight, plunging into darkness so sudden and complete that he felt weightless, as if the floor and ceiling had vanished, leaving him suspended in emptiness where sound and touch were his only guides. Rain on the leaves sounded louder, with vision lost, each drop a tiny drumbeat. The creek's voice reemerged as a steady growl beyond the trees, not tied to a direction, but to a dimension, a low undercurrent he could, if he listened long enough, relate to the slope beneath his feet. He flexed his toes inside wet boots, noticing the pull in his calves, and how his weight slowly shifted forward if he relaxed, deducing he remained on ground sloping downward. Trusting that angle more than tricks of paths or circling thoughts, he could regain some forward progress. Cold seeped in faster without light, as if the flashlight had served as a fragile barrier against the night, so he clicked it back on, its narrow beam a precious island amid the dark. The can swung slightly on its twine, faintly creaking. Though small, the sound sparked unease because it signaled action, something moved by a hand, even if his own. He checked the time again, not to change anything, but to anchor his realization. 11:10 p.m. In roughly 40 minutes since leaving the bus, he'd wandered enough to create a looping path disguised as progress. Unless he adjusted now, he'd spiral endlessly until exhaustion, sunrise, or something worse stopped him. A dry, humorless thought briefly crossed him that if this were a story in a warm room, he'd dismiss the character blindly walking in circles, yet the mountain stripped away that distance, reminding him that understanding a behavior in theory is different from feeling fear and fatigue pull at his mind. He took a slow breath, exhaled through his nose, and refocused outward, listening past his body's noise to the forest. Behind his light's edge, a branch shifted with a damp thud from water runoff, and farther away on, another ridge of faint cracking sounded like wood breaking, followed by a muted crash, possibly a slight or fallen tree. The creek's rumble grew louder in one part of his circle, so he oriented himself toward it, using the slope to confirm he was descending. Relying on sound and feel rather than sight was as much art as science. He knew he could be mistaken, but standing still with his can creaking and the weight of his loop felt riskier. He resumed walking, focusing on the gentle slope, letting his feet guide him, his senses sharp, as if the forest had noticed his awareness and become more curious about his next move. Moving carefully, he understood that losing focus could send him into unrecognizable patterns until it was too late. For now, this concentration kept dread at bay as he paid close attention to the terrain and creek, too occupied to grasp the harsh reality. He was alone in an unfamiliar wet forest with a dying battery and 11 lives depending on his choices. The flashlight's beam cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, reflecting off mud, rocks, and exposed roots twisting like veins across the forest floor. Occasionally, a spider's web strung between branches shimmered with water, reminding him to focus on small details. This made the vast landscape feel more manageable, just careful steps, avoiding branches, balancing on slopes rather than an overwhelming scene of possible failure. But fear crept in, filling even the narrow spaces between each step with doubts, images, and questions. As minutes passed, a whisper in his mind grew louder, suggesting the bus was farther than before, rain drenching the cut bank, sounds behind him possibly signaling a landslide, metal shifting, voices shouting. He fought the impulse to look back, knowing the bus had already vanished behind the trees, and seeing only darkness wouldn't soothe him. Instead, he clung to the thought of Annie at home, imagining her sleeping in her small room beneath glow-in-the-dark stars, unaware that he was climbing through a mountain he'd driven around, but never through. Thinking of her tight in his chest, forging a link between this cold night and a future he desperately wanted. Yet, he also knew another outcome: he could be taken not by a sudden avalanche, but through small mistakes that cause a fall, a broken leg, a dead phone battery, a silent bus slipping into the ravine while he lay helpless. His breathing quickened, not because the terrain had suddenly become steeper, but because his thoughts had. Years of managing others, panic told him he was slipping from cautious fear into paralyzing dread, clouds that clouded his judgment and increased mistakes. The forest pressed in with leaning trunks, reaching branches, thickening shadows, though he knew physically nothing had changed. He forced himself to slow, shortening his steps, counting breaths, the familiar numbers tangled with his racing thoughts. 11 people, 8 years since the last accident, 5 miles, 21% battery, 1 daughter, 1 bus, 1 man. The calculations only deepened the ache in his chest. each figure echoing one cruel truth: insufficient time, margin, or certainty. The terrain here had flattened, blending into a broad, indistinct plain where his legs no longer indicated up or down. The subtle change, along with the creek's muffled murmur, fading into an ambient hum from all directions, left him feeling unmoored beyond mere geography, as if the mountain had silently severed his last ties to this way as forward awaiting his awareness. He did notice, but didn't find a solution. Instead, a wave of nausea arose from his stomach, lodging in his throat with a sour metallic taste unrelated to the air. For a moment, he had the strange urge to sit and put his head between his knees, thinking someone might offer water and a towel. Instead, he stopped beside a wet, dark fallen log, leaning against it, his hands slipping before gripping a rough knot. The contact with solid wood was grounding yet unpleasant, reminding him how much of the world was soaked, living matter that was indifferent to his presence. His heart pounded loudly, felt in his fingertips, throat, and behind his eyes while his thoughts spiraled outward, flickering between memories like stopping the bus against orders years ago and fears of future disasters. The memory of the supervisor's mixed relief and annoyance haunted him, along with doubts about his own certainty that had curdled under punishment. A voice in his mind whispered, not his father's, but the internal critic echoing every past remark, telling him his instincts might harm or help. You left the road thinking you knew better. What if that was wrong? Since the tire dropped, every step might have been a mistake impossible to undo. His hand on the log trembled as he approached the edge where people often act recklessly, running without purpose, shouting into darkness, flickering the flashlight desperately, calling out to unseen others, trying to outrun the growing sense of being lost in space and themselves. He sat on the wet log, the cold shock grounding him, a fleeting sense of realness amid fading memories. The flashlight's beam cast a small patch of leaves and a pale mushroom, a fragile sign of life in a night of blurred boundaries. He thought of Annie not as an abstract reason to go on, but as the girl from that morning, spreading peanut butter on bread, her tongue poking out with focus, messy hair hurriedly tied, dropping a foil-wrapped sandwich into his bag with pride, as if it would keep him safe. He realized he had eaten that sandwich unknowingly during his run, its flavor already faded, and if he failed out here, that simple act of care might be their last shared moment, an ordinary act, overshadowed by a night neither of them foresaw when the alarm rang at 5. His reflection sparked what calculations couldn't, making his return feel painfully personal, beyond duty or morality. It was no longer about rescuing strangers, it was about not leaving that chair empty in a way no 8-year-old could understand, with rain and slopes and policies irrelevant. He paused, feeling the weight and heat of that emotion in his chest, then decided to act not driven by geography, but by refusing to let fear dictate his next move. He wouldn't die on this log in these woods, with his world reduced to a damp mushroom and a flashlight circle. If the mountain took him, it wouldn't be because he froze, paralyzed by panic. He shifted to stand, but the ground betrayed him silently. Beneath what seemed solid, leaf-covered earth was a hidden edge, a water-eroded hole with a fragile crust. His foot sank into the void up to the knee, causing him to tip sideways. He flung out his left hand to break the fall, the flashlight skittering and bouncing before pointing into the bushes. Pain shot through his hand when it hit hidden rock under leaves, a bright white-hot jolt pulsing up his arm, grayifying his vision briefly. He tasted copper, realizing he bit his tongue, lying half-twisted, one leg trapped, one arm stretched, breath shallow from shock. The damp ground chilled him, and smells of crushed vegetation and earth filled his nose. He cursed quietly, not with blame, but with a raw, involuntary sound acknowledging pain and stupidity of the fall. He pulled his foot free with a wet noise, mud smeared inside his boot, then rolled onto his back, gazing at the dark sky through branches. His hand throbbed with each heartbeat, each pulse delivering more pain. When he lifted it into the flashlight's beam, he saw torn skin at his thumb base and palm heel bleeding into rainwater, creating pink streaks down his wrist. He flexed his fingers, relieved they moved, stiff but functional, with no sharp internal pains, just tender, soft tissue from the impact. Pain anchored him in his body, but he still persisted holding the flashlight, grabbing branches. In a strange way, it helped because it pulled him from radial fears into concrete manageable problems. He tore fabric from his jacket liner beneath Karlov's coat, wrapped it around his hand, and tightened it with his teeth. Though soaked immediately, it kept dirt out and held his skin, giving him a small sense of control that steadied him beyond deep breaths. He lay still, feeling his pulse slow from frantic to steady, and noticed the sky had changed, clouds above thinner, streaked with smoky gray, then parted in a ragged tear, revealing a faint clear star against the dark. For a moment, he couldn't identify it, couldn't fit that tiny light into any familiar map from childhood. Then his mind recognized its position relative to a faint, ghostly shape nearby. It was the North Star, not from expertise, but because he had traced that pattern with Annie on her bedroom ceiling, fingers following glow in the dark points amid stories of sailors and travelers seeking home. The coincidence, or whatever it was, that he was lying in a random patch of Appalachian forest after fall, with a cloud gap just right, might seem trivial elsewhere, but here, soaked, wounded, and frayed, it felt like a stubborn alignment of unlikely elements. He knew not to trust the star's precise spot with clouds closing in, yet it provided him with something his spinning mind lacked, a fixed point beyond himself and immediate threats, unaffected by rain, branches, or past mistakes, guiding his way. He rolled onto his side, grunted, pushed up slowly, favoring his injured hand, and oriented himself, so the faint star sat where north belonged on his mental map, then carefully positioned valley relative to it. It was rough navigation, something his father would have called for landmarks and contour lines, but it was enough, a decision made from a place of stubborn resolve rather than panic. As he stood, adjusting the flashlight strap to rest his injured hand, he became aware of a layered sound beneath the rain in distant creek. At first, he thought it was his own breath, but as he stayed still and listened, he realized it was separate, coming from the darkness around him. It was the faintest movement, small purposeful footsteps evenly spaced, too heavy for leaves or random branches, circling just beyond his light without a clear direction, like something pacing just out of reach, aware of his presence. He remained still, reminiscent of the time he stood stiffly at a depot garage when a forklift tipped a pallet, muscles tensed, knowing the next move would define everything. As he held his breath, the footsteps persisted at a measured, unhurried rhythm, more deliberate than a lone deer or wind-blown branches, something understanding its own weight and placement. The rain had lightened to mist during his stumble, and in the silence, forest sounds separated clearly, water dripping from leaves, the distant roar of a swollen creek, occasional limb cracks. Over these, like a thread through a weave, were the footsteps' soft padded impacts on wet leaves and soil, never too close or far, circling patiently like a predator measuring him. His heart, which had just begun to fall from adrenaline, pounded anew, but this fear was sharper, ancient beyond reason or stories, recognizing the pattern of being watched by a predator older than any human story or route. He knew from articles that real wolves rarely prey on humans, being shy and avoiding conflict, but the awareness that whatever was pacing was not avoiding him, it was drawing a deliberate circle, made him cautious. He slowly turned, raising his flashlight, its beam illuminating the wet bark, making droplets sparkle like glass, transforming the forest into a cathedral of damp wood and leaves. Then the light caught a shape at the edge of its reach, and he froze. At the edge of the beam, just inside the thickening undergrowth, a pair of eyes reflected a flat greenish glow, unmoving and unblinking, set in a low forward-leaning head with pricked ears. For a moment, only the shadow of the animal was visible, a darker outline against the darkness, a hint of shoulders, faint breath steaming in the cool air. As his eyes adjusted, he discerned the long muzzle, the dense damp fur close to a lean body, and forelegs partly apart, not in a crouch to pounce, but relaxed, suggesting a creature confident it need not prove itself yet. He could have mistaken it for a large dog or a stray hunting animal, if not for the multiple pairs of reflective eyes, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaced around the circle of trees at roughly the same height, each attached to a body that coiled with ease, ready to cover ground. This was a ring of wolves, coywolves, or some hybrid born of long adaptation. Labels didn't matter. What mattered was he stood amid a loose, deliberate formation of 5 wild canids, focused on him in the narrow Appalachian night. Part of his mind, recalling wilderness safety guidelines written in a droning tone: don't run, don't turn away, make yourself appear bigger, speak firmly, throw objects, knew these were meant for daylight encounters at campsites, not for this suspended moment where the animals neither advanced nor retreated, merely observed. He swallowed, his dry mouth feeling like cotton despite the damp air, and tried to focus on behavior, on facts beyond folktales. Packs hunted deer and ungulates, using strategy, flanking, and terrain to separate prey from the herd. They generally avoided attacking humans who stood firm and made noise. In fact, they often found humans problematic and preferred to steer clear when possible. "Okay," he said, his voice sounding unusual, rough, and too deep, as if spoken by someone else. He didn't shout, feeling it would be wrong in this tight space, as screaming might break his fragile composure and send him into chaos. Instead, he kept his tone firm and steady, like addressing an upset passenger he couldn't anger. "You've made your point." The wolf directly in front of him didn't flinch, its ears twitched, and he saw from its slight shift of weight onto one forepaw that it recognized him and understood the object in the circle was alive and speaking. Its fur, dark gray with lighter streaks reflecting the flashlight, lay smooth against a lean distance optimized body, not gaunt, but built more for endurance. Its tail hung loosely with a gentle downward curve, not threatening. He slowly turned, keeping his upper body facing the wolf while his feet moved in a careful half circle. The flashlight beam shifted across the eyes of 5 animals arranged with rough symmetry, indicating this formation was deliberate. They were not perfectly aligned, but their angles covered enough ground that a random charge would be near at least one of them. They did not growl or show teeth. They merely watched, their heads smoothly tracking him like radar dishes, adjusting as he turned, keeping 1 or 2 sets of eyes always in his line of sight. Their silent, non-threatening demeanor unnerved him more than aggression, indicating patience and evaluation he could not predict. His primal fear urged him to withdraw, to increase distance, yet his experience with traffic flow and reactions told him retreat would only cede control and invite them to circle around him. Instead, he shifted his shoulders slightly toward the clearing's other side, where the land likely sloped into the valley, pine woods sleeping under rain, unaware of his approach through ancestral stories. As he moved, he noticed something subtle: a wolf slightly ahead to his right, larger than the others, with a presence that occupied more space despite its posture. Its shoulders appeared heavier, its chest broader, and the fur thicker around the neck. Its head sat slightly higher, level rather than angled, as if used to seeing over its companions. Most notable was the ragged notch in its right ear, a torn crescent, healed yet unmistakable, a scar marking it beyond any human name. It stood in front, slightly off-center in the ring, forming a shallow crescent with the others behind and beside it, bodies angled toward its flanks, ready to move with it if needed. Realizing it was a leader not in fairy tale, but in predator hierarchy, sent a chill through him, as any decision would depend on this animal's choice. He focused on that torn ear and unblinking eyes beneath it, fighting to keep his breathing steady. Animals could smell fear chemically and read it through body language, the way weight shifted, eyes darted. Rationally, he thought that if he projected calm, a mix of threat and equals, he might avoid triggering aggressive instincts. The idea of trying to call out or make contact vanished. These weren't domestic dogs to coax with soft words, and any sound would be for himself, not them. He chose movement over speech, one slow step toward the gap between the wolves. As he moved, two of them shifted forward without losing composure, eyes fixed on him. The large wolf with the torn ear held its ground, muscles tense, signaling he would face resistance if he pushed further. He then angled toward thinner trees nearby, where a faint, clearer trail suggested an escape. The wolves guarding that side responded, forming an unbroken living barrier, not snarling, just blocking his path. He realized with awe and fear that their positioning resembled that of herd animals planning a collective response with him at the center. His mind, though racing, noted this behavior wasn't typical of an aggressive attack. If they wanted to strike immediately, they could have attacked in seconds. They were guiding his movement, stopping him from slipping in one direction. The strange question was whether they protected him from something worse. It seemed insane in normal surroundings, but after his fallen shoulder, the hidden void that swallowed his leg, and the creek's roaring echo, he couldn't dismiss the idea that he might fall off an unseen cliff or ravine. These wolves, whose territory no map could define, knew the land better than he did. The thought of predators as reluctant guides rather than threats resembled a forgotten myth. Old roofs, stories of haints, hounds, and creatures that walked between worlds. Yet, physically, when he moved toward areas that made sense to his exhausted mind, the wolves intervened. When he shifted toward a specific patch of trees to his left, that part seemed to relax slightly, as if a hidden door had cracked open. He tested it carefully, shifting his weight gradually, like changing lanes on a busy highway, smooth and cautious, without sudden jolts. The wolves observed heads tracking him, paws adjusting, yet the coordinated barrier they'd previously formed did not reappear. The large wolf with the torn ear lifted its head slightly, eyes flicking from him to the forest patch and back again. There was a patient, assessing look, almost an invitation, though he couldn't interpret wolf signals through human metaphors. He doubted what he saw, knowing humans tend to turn coincidences into guidance to ease uncertainty. Standing frozen in this living ring, waiting for a clear sign, wouldn't bring him closer to the valley or bus. The mountain's erosion and his stamina, battery, and cold now ticked down. He examined the torn ear again, the rain-darkened fur, and the unwavering eyes, and made a decision that would seem foolish on a clear day, but felt right now. He chose to act as if the wolves weren't just surrounding him, but guiding his path. Slowly stepping toward the gap, they seemed less focused on closing. As he moved, the circle shifted gently, animals pacing to keep distance, letting his course tilt toward the trees. It was like walking within a living diagram, flanking, funneling, channeling, yet instead of fleeing prey, he was following a path shaped by creatures he'd been taught to fear. The torn ear wolf was the first to move, breaking the silence, and loped steadily away into the brush, glancing back as if to confirm he was tracking. The others lingered around him briefly, then, as if prompted by a subtle signal he couldn't sense, they dispersed, melting into the trees on either side, some staying at a short distance behind, others moving parallel like a loose escort. He could have stayed put, watched them leave, convinced himself that the tension had broken, and their departure meant he was free to follow his plan, walking in whatever direction his imperfect compass pointed. Yet, the sight of that ragged ear vanishing among the trunks tugged at something irrational inside him. It felt, in a strange, profound way, like being offered an uncertain hand across a stream by a stranger he didn't trust, rather than risking wading into deeper, faster water than it seemed. "Fine," he muttered, more to himself than to them, voice just loud enough to be swallowed by the damp air. "Let's see where you go." He moved forward, following the wolf's path, the flashlight beam flickering over the wet ground, roots, stones, and mud, his awareness now including the soft, almost silent presence of padded feet nearby in all directions, the pack adjusting to the terrain. The fear persisted. It clung like a prickling awareness that he was among predators with jaws capable of crushing bone, that a sudden decision to attack could turn this cautious march into a deadly encounter. Yet alongside this fear, a fragile thread of trust had begun to form, not in their intentions, which remain unknown, but in their familiar knowledge of this treacherous night, wet land. Every time he instinctively moved toward the faint downhill slope, seeming faster and easier, the wolves on that side shifted closer, bodies angled to steer him back toward the big wolf's path. When he deliberately veered into darker, denser underbrush, the faint sound of dislodged rocks and distant rushing water answered him a split second after the wolves' ears flicked in that direction, as if they knew what lay ahead before sound confirmed it. He moved not in a surrendering, mindless way, but with cautious awareness, choosing temporarily to relax his need for control and accept a deeper, older logic guiding him. Pain pulsed through his bandaged hand, a reminder of his body's fragility, and strength as clouds sealed the sky, hiding the star that was his last fixed point. His new reference was the wolf, moving through the trees with a ragged ear, glancing back, which oddly reassured him. It was as if the creature, under different circumstances, might have been instinctively leading him. For a time, each step behind the torn-eared wolf felt like a defiance of inherited stories and prejudices, as if every step on what seemed like fragile common sense was a threat of falling into cold, harsh truth. Trusting wild predators in the forest appeared reckless. Yet the fear didn't materialize. Instead, gradually, something began to shift, like a muscle relaxing after long tension, the feeling of certainty returning. The wolves moved at a steady, unhurried lope, covering ground efficiently without exhausting themselves. Matching their pace required him to move differently. Instead of constantly stopping to recheck, he committed to their rhythm, trusting their path wouldn't suddenly lead into dense undergrowth or a hidden drop. With this confidence, the endless micro-decisions that cluttered his mind decreased, clearing mental space for new thoughts. He observed the forest, transforming it thin from dense rhododendrons and bushes into taller, older trees with branches higher above ground, creating a vaulted space beneath the canopy. Between the trunks, he could see 10 to 15 yards ahead, a vastness that felt almost luxurious compared to the earlier tightness. The ground beneath shifted with exposed clay and leaf-dense hollows, giving way to a pine needle carpet that muffled their steps and provided firmer footing. The rain slowed to a steady mist that hung like a veil, catching his flashlight's beam in tiny points. Most of it was blocked by branches, so only scattered cold drops touched his face or neck, enough to make him flinch but not soak him. The scents changed with terrain where earlier had been the metallic tang of saturated soil and dank rotting leaves. Now the air was filled with the clean aroma of wet pine sap, mixed with the musky odor of damp fur, animal sweat, and outdoor bodies. The front torn-eared wolf would pause at features he couldn't see, ditches, moss-covered logs, abrupt ground shifts to glance back, its eyes reflecting his light briefly, as if checking his presence and attention. It then moved again, adjusting its route to navigate obstacles efficiently. At a shallow, swiftly flowing stream part of the larger creek, he followed. The wolves crossed carefully, demonstrating their deep familiarity with the terrain. Instead of crossing straight at the nearest point, they angled upstream, choosing a spot where submerged stones formed a chain of tiny islands. The torn-eared wolf stepped lightly between rocks, paws finding firm purchase on the slick surface, with the others following precisely, forming a deliberate, almost ceremonial procession. When his turn arrived, he stepped where they had, feeling for rougher textures under the water where moss was anchored, using the flashlight to distinguish color differences between pools and crossings. Though cold seeped through his soles and numbed his toes, he crossed without slipping, a small victory more meaningful than the distance, proof that man and animals momentarily align. His injured hand pulsed with each move, the makeshift bandage tight on his swollen palm, sometimes switching the flashlight to his other hand to rest. The wolf sensed stronger when the beam neared the ground. The pain, instead of distracting, centered him. Each throb reminded him he was still embodied, his fears and choices rooted in real physical space, not an imaginary scenario. The high-pitched panic that had earlier underlain his thoughts had faded into a low hum, no longer overwhelming, allowing him to reflect with tired curiosity on how he had reached a point where trusting a wild animal seemed safer than trusting his own path. 8 years of carrying the memory of that first landslide in punishment for timely but wrong decisions had carved doubt and hesitation into his mind, turning channels into ravines. Suddenly, he realized that this was the first time since that firing he was trusting his instincts without immediate judgment or second guessing. He had left the road, chosen the forest over asphalt, continued after discovering his loop, and followed the wolves instead of outmaneuvering them. If his decisions were wrong, there would be no blame-shifting committee, only final and different consequences. Lost bureaucratic weight, the stakes felt clearer if not easier. They stopped at a clearing where a fallen decayed tree revealed pale water, stained wood. The torn-eared wolf approached a narrow, dark waterway, a drainage or sunken ground, and drank quickly, ears flicking at the night sounds. Others spread out, some standing guard, heads high, nostrils flaring. Others lay in wet leaves, tongues hanging, steam rising from their bodies. Alex noticed how hard he had been pushing, his lungs burned, thighs ached with steady fatigue, and his feet felt heavy inside his boots. He leaned against a tree, rough bark scraping his back, and looked up only to find the gray cloud ceiling unbroken, heavy and impenetrable. Using his water bottle, a habit from rural roots where depots lacked reliable fountains and gas stations closed early, he sipped cautiously, the cool liquid washing away fear, copper, and wet bark. It seemed absurd in a quietly comic way to share this moment with wolves drinking from a murky runoff, their bodies adapted to mountain bacteria, while he, used to tap water in pools, rationed his filtered ounces like a hoarder. He watched the torn-eared wolf drink, noting details now that immediate fear had dulled, its thicker, lighter fur around the neck forming a rough, faint ribs visible on deep breaths, indicating a lean but not starving frame, old scars around its muzzle-thin puckered lines like past encounters written on flesh. As it lifted its head, a metallic glint near its neck caught his flashlight beam. At first, he thought it was just wet fur reflecting light, but then the shape clarified into something too regular rust-streaked material partially buried under its coat. He stepped half a pace closer, raising the light for a better look. Behind him, a wolf emitted a low growl, vibrating through his spine. He immediately stopped, palms open, a calming gesture for himself, and adjusted the beam to avoid shining into the torn-eared wolf's eyes. The light traced along its neck, revealing the remains of a collar, a cracked, weathered strip of leather, with a small misshapen metal loop where a tag might have hung. It was so embedded in the fur that the hair had grown around it, obscuring its outline, and near the skin, a faint groove suggested the wolf's body had reshaped itself to fit this foreign band over the years. It was an artifact from another life, a silent witness that this creature had once lived near humans, possibly as a pup in a yard, or as a working animal before falling back into the wild, leaving a decayed collar mark. Seeing it stirred an unexpected feeling, the wolf, usually embodying wild logic and otherness, suddenly seemed tethered to the world of driveways and porches. It didn't make the animal safer or turn it into a dog, but it challenged his mental divide between domesticated order and the predatory forest. Here was a being that had shifted between these worlds, carrying a piece of one into the other not through destiny, but because humans once believed they could control it, only to be mistaken. He wondered grimly if he was any different, walking behind a creature shaped by both human and wild forces, with his invisible collar rules, schedule, fear loosening as the mountain's raw presence made all that irrelevant. For the first time since leaving the pavement, he felt kinship with another creature not through species or fate, but as once pushed from a small, predictable world into a harsher, unpredictable one. The torn-eared wolf finished drinking, shook water in a small sparkling arc that caught his flashlight, then turned. It flicked him a brief unreadable look and moved on, slipping between trees with quiet grace, its shoulders lightly rolling under wet fur. The others rose, shaking out their coats, and quickly formed around him with practiced ease. He instinctively stepped away from the tree, following almost automatically, feeling for a brief moment like a chain link rather than a vulnerable flailing point. As they moved forward, the creek's sound grew clearer, rising out of the rain and forest background into a rushing presence. He realized they weren't heading straight to it, but moving along a contour that kept the water at a steady distance, like walking along a shallow bowl's edge, instead of dropping into its center. That pattern seemed deliberate. Only someone familiar could guide the group along flood-swollen channels without stumbling into washouts or hidden banks softened by the rain. His mind, now off micro-navigating thanks to someone else's effort, began drifting into unpleasant thoughts. He remembered the bus, its passengers, how they might now be quieter, their adrenaline replaced by exhaustion from waiting for something uncontrollable. He pictured their faces when he left the worry in Marina's, Karlov's forced bravado, old Ruth's calm, and wondered how they now saw him, out here in the dark. He suspected some had already turned him into a story, a figure moving through the woods with ease that didn't match his slow, awkward progress. It was easier that way. When trapped, people prefer to believe the rescuer is almost mythical incompetence, because accepting that they're just as scared and fallible as you is too hard to bear. He was unsure whether this made his actions more or less cruel, but he knew the only way to bridge their imagined and actual selves was to continue following this strange compass until the trees ended and lights appeared. When he checked his phone briefly, it glowed with a battery icon indicating 14%, and the time 12:11 a.m. marked the slow passage of night with mechanical detachment. He turned it off to conserve power, thinking any signal would be better closer to Pinewood, where cell towers might reach the valley, than under the dense canopy, blocking even the sky. The wolves ignored his battery in the minutes. Their world was measured by scent, hunger, territory, and the immediacy of each step. Yet, as they moved, he sensed they carried more than casual patrol. They had a destination, even if unseen, and moved with steady purpose, making his earlier circling seem like child's play. After what might have been 20 minutes or an hour time feeling fuzzy since the fallen log, the air's texture shifted subtly around him. It became less dense, less soaked with rain-washed wood scent, and carried a faint, almost domestic smell, a trace of smoke, thin but unmistakable, drifting through the damp air from wood that was cut and burned intentionally, rather than fallen and rotting. His reaction was immediate and visceral. His chest tightened, and for a moment he thought it was panic, but then he sensed hope, a sharp, dangerous emotion that could cut or lift. Smoke signaled nearby people's chimneys, stoves, hands stacking logs, and for the first time since entering the forest, Pinewood became more than lines on a map. The torn-eared wolf's ears flicked, and it quickened slightly, muscles working with more energy, as if this scent was part of its journey all along. The others adjusted silently, tightening their formation briefly, then moving between trees. Alex felt his legs respond, the ache fading behind the pull forward. He avoided imagining porch lights, gravel under tires, or a man opening the door to find a soaked stranger with an unlikely story images just out of reach, like the North Star behind clouds. Instead, he watched the wolf's back, the collar dull and rusty, once claimed and now lost, leading him into the smell of smoke. If Mountain had sent a guide, it chose one more aware of the complex line between ownership and freedom. He caught the village's scent before seeing it, wood smoke thickening with cooking fat, damp ash, and a slightly acrid odor from homes with stoves and furnaces. With each breath, Pinewood initially dots on a map, a line on a sheet became real, a cluster of houses holding actual people, likely asleep now, unaware that a man and pack of wolves were approaching through wet trees. The ground under his boots gradually leveled, the careful sideways traverse along the slope, turning into the bottom of a broad shallow bowl. The creak's sound faded behind, muffled by earth. In its place, subtle noises arose ahead and slightly right, the faint hum of a transformer, a steady electrical thrum distinct from natural sounds, distant clanking metal echoes, and possibly a ghostly tune or the low murmur of a TV left on. The trees thinned subtly, shifting from dense trunks to wider gaps, revealing patches of sky. Suddenly, he emerged from the last trees into a yard, not a true clearing, but an open space. It took him a moment to grasp what he saw, his eyes trained on black and wet green, resisting the sight of rectangles and straight lines, something surreal about human order amid the wild. 20 yards ahead stood a one-story house, its simple metal shingled roof glistening. A wide porch stretched across the front, its railing sagging slightly, with two rocking chairs beside the door, as if awaiting their owners. The porch light was off, but a faint yellow glow from a nearby window cast a wash of color onto the wet-packed dirt driveway, where an older pickup truck sat nose towards the road, mud streaks lining its sides. The truck's bed contained tools, a coil of rope, and a rusty lawn chair frame. Beyond, faint light revealed house shapes, one with a metal carport, another with a satellite dish facing a narrow gravel lane like a shallow stream. The familiar space felt jarring as his body, conditioned for uneven ground and animal movement, now faced porch steps, fences, hoses, and possibly a nearby chained dog that might bark at his approach, waking the valley. It was as if he'd crossed an invisible boundary. The rules he'd adapted to earlier no longer applied cleanly, replaced by complex property codes, late-night noises, and the wary, hospitable tone of small towns. Suddenly, he noticed the change in the night the wolves had stopped. Turning, he saw them at the forest's edge, partially in shadow, partly lit by the house's faint glow. The torn-eared wolf led slightly ahead, paws on damp leaves, eyes fixed on him with a unique, intense stare, longer confined by the forest's closeness. For a suspended moment, they looked across the thin strip of ground between them. He thought of the collar beneath the torn fur, of how the animal expertly navigated slopes and streams, and felt a rising urge to speak, to acknowledge that, instinctively or through some ancient silence, they had brought him here, where help might exist. But words felt clumsy now. He simply nodded briefly, a gesture that might seem foolish if others had seen, but felt perfectly right amid him, the wolves and the wet grass. The torn-eared wolf flicked an ear as if catching an inaudible sound, then slowly turned, vanishing into the deeper darkness of the trees. One by one, the others followed, their forms dissolving into the shadows of trunks, until the forest edge appeared as blank and unmoving. As before, he arrived with only the faint scent of wet fur remaining to show they had been there. He paused, now alone, the silence no longer threatening, but filled with potential doors open, voices ready, engines waiting, and then he moved, stiff-legged, toward the house, following the dirt path to the porch. Each step produced a soft sucking sound as his boots left the wet ground. At the bottom, he automatically wiped them on the stair's edge, a pointless, ingrained courtesy. That made him briefly feel like a latecomer at home, rather than a stranger with trouble in his pockets. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, familiar with years of drying, soaking, heating, and cooling. As he climbed, the scent of smoke and food grew stronger, accented by hints of coffee, fried onions, and faint sour linoleum cleaner. Reaching the top, he paused before a peeling painted door, revealing layers of old colors, white over, blue over, faded green, and raised his good hand to knock, his injured one resting against Karlov's coat. The door's wood was cold under his knuckles, and his knock sounded unnaturally small, amid everything that led up to it, dull thuds that could drown in a louder storm or a humming TV. He listened to the house like the forest, trying to distinguish its creaks and hums from external silence. For a few seconds, all he heard was the low drone of the transformer and soft hiss of mist on the roof. Inside, he heard a chair scrape, something set down on a table, and a man's voice, thick with sleep and suspicion, calling out, "Yeah." Hold on, implying he wasn't expecting or welcoming visitors at this hour. The deadbolt clicked, the doorknob turned, and a narrow gap opened, held by a chain allowing just a few inches of space. In this gap, framed by chipped paint and warm air spilling from inside, Alex saw a man in his late 50s or early 60s, with gray hair raked back and a sun-worn squinting face. He wore a white undershirt and flannel pajama pants, one socked foot and one bare, as if half ready to leave, but then hesitated. His eyes flicked over Alex's face, down to the mud on his pants, up to the blood-stained bandage on his hand and soaked coat, then past him to the yard and trees beyond, as if verifying he wasn't part of some late-night drama that would bring more bodies onto the porch. "You lost," the man said, more a challenge than a question, implying being lost tonight called for a serious explanation. "There's a bus," Alex replied, voice rough from disuse, which he realized was mostly true, apart from muttering to wolves. "Up on the pass. Route 221. We hit a slide. The right front wheel's gone into a washout, and the shoulder's falling apart underneath. 11 people on board, no cell service. We need a tractor or tow to pull us back before the road fails." Frank's expression changed, shifting from suspicion to practicality. He quickly considered available machinery, neighbors, and the road conditions. He partially closed the door to remove the chain, then opened it fully. Warm air from inside washed over Alex, carrying the scent of potatoes, bacon, wood smoke, and an old dog resting on the rug. "I'm Frank," he said, gesturing brusquely but hospitably. "Boots on that mat. Please provide the text you'd like me to rewrite in English, and I'll be glad to help." He freed one set, the metal jingling, then tossed a second onto the table with a clatter. "Bus is stuck on the city side of the pass," Alex said, sketching a rough map with his finger, damp sleeve leaving a faint trail. "Road's 2-lane blacktop, cut bank on one side, drop on the other, no guardrail. We're just past the 47 marker, shoulder edges let go under the right front. Soil saturated, still settling when I left." Frank grunted, a low response that could be sympathy or simple acknowledgement. "Road has been trying to repair that stretch since it was cut. They patch it, it slides again, and they patch once more, like covering rot with paint. You mentioned 11 people. Were there any kids?" "One boy," Alex replied, voice catching as he said it, picturing Danny's small sleeping face, 5 years old, a few older women. One person with a twisted ankle from pushing, others shaken but okay, for now. "That's all I needed," Frank said grimly, voice flat and decisive, as if something clicked inside. He grabbed the second set of keys and motioned toward the other room. "Earl has the tractor to pull you off without falling. He lives next door and sleeps soundly unless something explodes. I'll keep pounding until he wakes. You can still ride back now." Alex's legs hurt as if they'd prefer sitting, but worry about the rain-damaged hillside and the waiting bus made him decide. "I won't sit until that bus is on level ground," he said, sounding steadier and more like his old self before 8 years of doubt. "Good," Frank replied, as if that was the only answer he'd accept. "We've already lost enough time tonight." Frank slipped into work boots without socks while Alex stood by the table. The room's warmth began to dull his muscle pain, shifting it from sharp to deep. His hand throbbed beneath the bandage, dried blood cracking as swelling grew, catching Frank's attention as he straightened, narrowing his eyes. "You fall?" he asked, and Alex nodded, giving an uncommitted sound. "Got peroxide and bandages if you don't want it worse, but I guess we're on a timer. We'll handle it when we return." The assumption they come back, finishing the night tending minor wounds after dealing with the main problem, loomed over Alex like a warm blanket, just as comforting as the stove's heat. It wasn't blind optimism, but the practical mindset of a man who had faced enough tough nights to see them as solvable until proven otherwise. Frank turned off the stove burner, moved the pot to a cooler spot, then grabbed two mismatched mugs from a cupboard, pouring thick dark coffee into both from an old drip pot that looked like it had been used since the 80s. He handed one to Alex without asking if he wanted it, and the first bitter lukewarm sip, faintly tasting of last week's brew, hit his stomach like fuel, waking a part of him that had started to sag, reminding him he hadn't eaten since before the route his body ran on more than adrenaline. "Come on," Frank said, setting his mug down unfinished and grabbing a canvas jacket from a hook. "You can tell the rest in the truck." Earl will argue about going in the dark, pretending his tractor is more delicate than it is, but he won't say no with a kid on that bus. Not here. They stepped into the night, the brief kitchen time making the air colder and sharper. The mist had thinned, now a fine sheen on the roof and a faint bead on the truck's hood. The sky above the village was a low cloud ceiling, reflecting a ghostly light from street lamps and porch bulbs, making the darkness feel less absolute but no less heavy. The house next door was just a few yards away across a yard enclosed by a sagging wire fence, similar in shape to Frank's, but with a lean-to full of unevenly stacked firewood and a tractor's rear and barely visible in shadows. A single porch light above the door cast a yellow cone onto the steps, where two boots lay randomly, one on its side, the other upright as if their owner had kicked them off exhaustedly. Frank didn't hesitate. He walked up the steps and pounded on the door with his fist, the sound loud enough in the quiet village to expect a light to flicker on further down the street. After a pause, there were shuffling sounds inside, followed by a faint thud of object bumping, and a rougher, fuller voice barked through the door, "If this ain't a fire, it can wait till morning." "It's worse than a fire," Earl Frank replied. "It's the county road department and their lazy patch jobs. Open up." The door opened to reveal a man slightly younger than Frank, perhaps in his early 50s, with a broad square face softened by sleep and a week's stubble, wearing a faded t-shirt with a gas station logo stretched over his belly. He blinked, then examined Alex, taking in his appearance, bandaged hand, and dried mud on his legs. "What did you boys do?" he asked, irritation giving way to curiosity. "Lost a bet with the mountain. There's a bus stuck on the pass," Frank said plainly. "Road slit under the right front, folks hanging over a drop without guardrail. No phones. No tow truck can make it up there. Use your tractor and chain to pull them back before they go off-road. Kid aboard." Earl's eyebrows raised at kid, revealing a tense flicker in his expression, like the one Frank showed in his kitchen, the one labeled "no choice." "Damn," Earl muttered, rubbing his face as sleep drained away. "They put up a roadwork ahead sign 3 months ago, but did nothing, just knocked down some rocks. Should have known it would cause problems." He re-entered the house silently, then reappeared immediately, slipping on heavy overalls over his t-shirt, quickly securing the straps. Sitting on the top step, he expertly fit his boots, more precisely than Frank had. He grabbed a knitted cap from a hook and pulled it over his ears, descending the steps with swift, efficient motions. His earlier grumble softened into a sharper focus. "How many people?" he asked, heading toward the lean-to where the tractor stood in the dark, its angular, massive silhouette, tires layered with dried mud from countless jobs. 11, Alex replied, feeling the number as a burden, not just a figure. 1 kid, 1 older woman, 1 with a broken ankle. Most are scared and cold, as expected. The ground is soft beneath the rear wheels, but they hold for now. Earl grunted, already moving the heavy barn door aside to reveal more of the tractor, its green paint dull from years, but still visible under grime. "Are you sure the road can handle me getting up there?" he asked, though he was checking the fuel line, tow hitch, and the chain coiled on a nearby hook like a sleeping metal snake. "No," Alex replied, because lying felt like a luxury he'd already used up. "But I'm sure the bus can't stay here much longer. We don't have time to debate what the county should have done." Frank snorted, humorlessly saying they should have put up a sign, "You're on your own past this point," to avoid pretending otherwise. Earl glared at Alex over the tractor's hood. "You the driver?" he asked, as if assigning blame to a single person. "Yes," Alex replied, meeting his gaze confidently. "I'm Alex." I chose to stop, the road didn't. I left them above to come get you. That was mine too. 3 men stood under Earl's porch light, the tractor like a heavy altar, heavy with words on fault, fate, and neglected mountain infrastructure that caused tragedy. Earl grunted, approving. Good, he said. If you'd waited for someone else to decide, it would be a different trip. He climbed into the tractor's cab, the metal steps ringing, and turned the key. The engine coughed twice before roaring to life a deep vibrating growl that shook dust loose from the rafters. After hours of rain, creak sounds, and his heartbeat, Alex's chest relaxed, he recognized this noise machinery responding to human command. Frank nodded toward his truck. You ride with Earl and show him the way, he said. I'll follow with chains and any others we pick up. There's one more house on the road where Hank's likely still awake, watching some sorry game. He has a winch we might need. Alex nodded, the logistics settling around him like a familiar harness, and climbed into Earl's tractor cab. The engine's warmth already seeped through the metal floor. As Earl slowly moved the tractor out of the lean-to and onto the narrow lane, its headlights cut glaring white cones through the mist. Alex glanced back instinctively at the line of trees at the village's edge. The dark forest beyond was an irregular wall, its trunks and branches absorbing the faint village light without returning any. He saw no sign of the wolves that brought him here, no eyes, no shifting shadows. Yet he felt their absence as clearly as their presence earlier, like the change in rain sounds on the bus roof after turning off the engine. Tell me about that section of road, Earl said, eyes ahead, guiding the tractor onto gravel with tires crunching loudly through the quiet village, the sound slipping under doors and into residents' dreams. Every curve, every soft shoulder felt unfamiliar. Alex took a breath and described the pass, his mouth moving while his mind lingered on the sound of footsteps in wet leaves, the flash of a torn ear in his light, and the rusted collar buried in thick fur reminders that the line between the worlds he was entering and leaving was less clear than he believed. The tractor from inside felt less a machine and more a determined creature, its tires moving stubbornly up the gravel lane, each tread biting into wet stone and dirt, as if it knew this was more than a midnight run, but a climb into unsafe territory. Sitting in the passenger seat with the smell of diesel and grease, Alex was struck by the contrast to the bus he left, where he controlled the speed and decisions, and now he was vulnerable to another's judgment and mountain's mood. That helplessness stirred old fears, reminiscent of 8 years ago when he sat in an office listening to someone recount his actions, turning caution into insubordination. Earl drove with practiced ease, his hand light on the wheel, eyes narrowed against the headlight glare on wet pavement. The beam revealed Pinewood's familiar stretch mailboxes, sagging gravel patches, a small church within steeple shrouded in clouds. As they passed the last house, the road narrowed into a 2-lane ribbon curving into the trees, the center line battered and neglected. Frank's pickup followed, headlights bouncing in the tractor's mirrors, with a distant third set of lights joining jittery, as if their owner decided this was worth waking the big machines for with stubborn tools. The convoy's engines and tires were the only sounds in the night, besides mist on the windscreen and loose chains rattling in the pickup bed. As they climbed, the village's faint electrical hum faded into the deeper silence of trees and rock. Road's gonna get tricky after the next bend, Alex said, shifting focus away from worry about the bus slipping in his absence. They paved over an old slide 2 years ago, but didn't remove the base. It looks smooth, but rides like a trampoline when wet. Earl Grunt acknowledged or disapproved, easing off the throttle as the tractor's engine lowered. The headlights lit the road ahead, revealing the subtle ripple in the wet asphalt dips and rises, hinting at underlying weakness. The tractor rolled over it with a muted thump, tires compressing the soft surface, and Alex felt it in his teeth and neck muscles. You weren't kidding, Earl said, adjusting his grip. They'll ignore it until half the hillside slides, then wonder why repairs cost so much. Because no one's here during rain, Alex replied, bitterness surfacing uninvited. They see the mountain on a clear day and forget its rage. The The road climbed higher, trees pressing in, branches arching like ancient beams, and as they ascended, the mist thickened, shrinking the visible world beyond the headlights. Water flowed in bright veins across the asphalt, signs of last rain, each rivulet tightening Alex's stomach. He knew what those tiny streams could become with time. "How long you been gone?" Earl asked, eyes on the road. "I left them around 10 to 10, Alex said, glancing at his watch out of habit, even though the numbers now felt almost accusatory. "By 11, I realized I was walking in circles. It took me another hour to get here with help I didn't know I needed. It's after 12, maybe close to 1. He didn't mention the wolves, not out of shame or fear of sounding crazy, though. He suspected that describing a pack of wild animals preventing me from walking off a cliff in the cramped space of the tractor cab would seem like an apology for something he didn't regret, but because it didn't fit into the logistics of chain lengths and tow angles. Grounds had 3 hours to decide what to do, Earl said, phrasing it as if the land had intentions, which resonated with Alex's memories of his father's stories about listening to hills and reading forest moods. "We'll see if it's feeling generous or not." They reached the first tighter switchbacks familiar from daylight drives, but tricky in rain, with a bus full of sleeping passengers. The tractor's engine strained as it navigated the heavy machine around the bend, headlights flashing briefly against the exposed rock on the uphill side before swinging out over the drop, revealing a glimpse of the ravine below a black, churning void with faint reflections from the swollen creek. His palms sweated, and he wiped his good hand on his pants, the damp fabric barely drying it. He imagined the bus ahead, its front dipped toward the void, the right front wheel buried in mud. He took deep breaths, inhale through his nose, exhale through his mouth to prevent his mind from freezing in fear. Behind them, the pickup headlights disappeared, then reappeared after the curve. Alex felt gratitude that these men had left warm beds for cold machines, driven by a stranger's story and the mention of a child. That act a tractor risking danger voluntarily, not because ordered, but because Ask stood in quiet opposition to distant absent decisions. As they climbed, fog thickened into a solid white wall, headlights reflecting droplets and obscuring their view. Earl slowed further, easing off the accelerator and leaning forward, as if closeness might improve his sight. "Visibility's poor," he said, voice tighter. "If your mile marker's off, we'll catch that bus quickly." "We won't," Alex replied, confident. A quarter mile before the slide, a camber change and asphalt hump will be felt in the wheel and your back. Then the left bank drops a yard or two, revealing more sky over the hood. "We start treating the road as if it's glass." Earl looked at him briefly, a slight twitch at his mouth. "You talk about that road like it's a woman you've argued with for 20 years. Alex shrugged, feeling heat rise to his face in the dim cab. When you drive the same route a lot, you begin thinking in moods, not miles. The cold makes this stretch sulk, while hot weather causes tantrums. The pass ahead, he gestured vaguely, pretends it's fine until it isn't. "You're right," Earl said, showing a hint of reluctant respect. "Let me know when she's pouting." They continued, the engine humming steadily, and Alex sensed the shift he'd long predicted. The wheel, under his light grip on the passenger side, vibrated with a faint buzz from the front tire's contact patches. The tractor's sway over a slight rise changed subtly, and the feeling of the cut bank on the left eased almost invisibly as the road's profile shifted. "Here," he said sharply, intentionally cutting the word short. "We're close." Earl nodded, jaw clenched, and slowed to a cautious crawl, the tractor's large tires rolling carefully, similar to how Alex tested the shoreline earlier, searching for solid rock beneath the water. The fog ahead thickened, engulfing everything beyond their beams, and in that limited visibility, every foot of pavement felt tense, like a road just before unstable bridge supports. For endless seconds, only wet asphalt gleamed beneath the headlights, its smooth sheen hiding microfractures. Gradually, a darker shape formed from the white, initially a faint mass, a smudge where light reflected poorly, and as they drew closer, The outline sharpened into lines and angles that Alex recognized instinctively before consciously realizing. The bus sat ahead, crooked across the lane, its rear still on firm road, while the front tilted toward the drop, making Alex's stomach churn even though he wasn't on it. The tractor's side stripe reflected its lights, flickering white before faint figures moved inside, drawn by the glow-like insects to a lamp. Inside, the bluish windows showed glimpses of a raised arm, bowed head, or a child's silhouette. For a terrifying moment, he thought the front end had slumped further, the right corner lower, closer to the void. But as the tractor approached and perspective shifted, he saw the mutt had settled more beneath the tire, yet the asphalt strip under the frame remained, a stressed narrow shelf bearing more weight than it should. His throat tightened, a hot pricking pressure formed behind his eyes, neither tears nor relief, and he swallowed hard as Earl whistled, more in awe than he might admit later. "Well, I'll be damned," Earl said. "She's still up, for now." The headlights illuminated the bus faces, Marina's pale strained features turning toward the light, eyes reflecting it, Danny's head lolling on her shoulder, still asleep amidst storms or quarrels, Karlov's silhouette near the front, one hand on the seat back, the other shading his eyes to see past the glare. Seeing them hit Alex hard, as if physically struck, released a sudden tight feeling inside him that had been building since entering the forest. They were there, standing tall, not gone without him. His fierce, wild gratitude mixed with guilt, knowing his absence could have changed the outcome, and a slight mountain shift might have made this scene different. "Stop just before the rear bumper," he said, voice strained from holding steady. "We don't want your sudden stop to trigger her." Earl gently braked, stopping yards from the bus. The pickup then pulled in behind them, engine ticking, followed by a battered SUV farther back, its headlights dimming as the driver shut off the engine. Doors opened, boots hit wet pavement, and the quiet night filled with low, purposeful sounds of men preparing for action. Alex cautiously exited the tractor, his stiff legs and injured hand throbbing with each heartbeat. The cold air and heavy mist quickly wetted his face and hair, blending the scent of wet earth, exhaust, and fear into a sharp metallic aroma, causing a throat ache. As he moved towards the bus, its front door hissed open, and Marina appeared at the top of the steps, arm around the pole, clutching Danny, who blinked awake with damp hair around his small face. They gazed at each other across the slick asphalt, the night and all its tension squeezed into that narrow space. She remained silent at first, and so did he. Words seemed unnecessary given what they both knew about the elapsed time, the risks he had faced, and those still ahead. Instead, she gave a sharp nod, expressing more than gratitude, anger, relief, and grudging respect for his help. He returned the gesture, feeling the tension in his chest ease a bit. Behind her, Karlov squeezed into the doorway, one hand on his phone, with only a single bar of signal visible in the corner from their elevation and the tractor's headlights. He looked older than at the depot, his bravado diminished, but his voice still carried its old authority. "Took your time," he said. Though it could sound like criticism, exhaustion softened the words, making them a reflexive jab after their shared ordeal. "Got lost," Alex said, since the truth, minus its strange middle chapters, remained the truth, then found better navigators and a tractor. "Let's move you all off this edge before the road remembers what it was trying to do." Earl and Frank uncoiled the heavy chain from the pickup, its links clanking and scraping over the wet road, metal dull under headlights. The third man, Hank, based on Frank's call, set up portable work lights on stands, their harsh glare adding brightness to the scene, turning the mist into a glowing haze. They worked quickly yet carefully, moving with the experience of those seasoned in handling stubborn machinery in worse conditions. Earl crawled under the bus to find a secure point, his boots sticking out from beneath the bumper, while Frank guided the chain to the tractor's hitch, his hands steady despite the wet metal. Hank held a flashlight at the edge of the drop, watching for movement in the mud near the front wheels, calling brief updates in a low voice. Alex moved among them, instinctively following hooking and hauling protocols, avoiding angles, respecting tension lines, feeling how weight shifted along the chain as the vehicle moved. His hand ached with every grip, but he ignored it, the pain blending into the night's background hum. He noticed in his peripheral vision passengers inside the bus pressing against windows or craning their necks, trying not to jostle each other as they watched the men attach the chain to the tractor. When the last shackle was secured and the chain tightened, Earl returned to the tractor cab, face focused and serious, with no room for jokes. He glanced at Alex near the rear uphill wheel, ready to call out if the frame shifted dangerously, then slowly engaged the gear. The chain tightened with a slow groaning sound, links straightening as slack disappeared. The bus shuddered, a collective murmur rising as the front corner sank deeper into the mud, the shoulder crumbling. But then the rear wheels bit into the asphalt and stable ground, and the vehicle began to inch backward, vibrating like a living thing resisting removal. Alex held his breath, muscles clenched, sensing Earl's shoulders through the cab, feeling the strain on the tractor's rear end slipping sideways before gaining grip. Frank and Hank kept pace, their eyes on the tires and drop edge, ready to signal Earl to stop if needed. The front wheels slowly escaped the mud, breaking suction with a sucking sound that sprayed dirt and water. The bus tilted slightly less forward, leveling off, prompting a half-sob, half-laugh from inside. The chain groaned again, stretching, and with a final lurch, the bus fully returned to solid asphalt, all wheels on relatively firm ground. "Hold it," Hank shouted, easing off the gas as the tractor's engine slowed. The chain loosened slightly with the release of tension, and a deep silence settled, broken only by the mist's gentle patter and the cooling metals ticking. Alex was shaken, not from the cold, but from the relief after hours of fear. His knees felt weak, his injured hand throbbed as if recalling its pain, and he steadied himself by pressing a hand against the bus's cold, damp metal, grounding him. Inside, people moved vigorously, some laughing, others quietly crying, releasing built-up tension through motion. Marina reappeared at the door, now without Danny in her arms. The boy, clutching her jeans, looked around with wide eyes, absorbing the scene, the tractor, the men, the chain like a child sensing seriousness. "Is it over?" he asked, his high, clear voice cutting through the adult noise. Almost, Alex said, honestly balancing what he wanted to say and the truth. "We're heading to Pinewood. You'll sleep in a real bed or on the floor and have warm food instead of vending machine stuff. Then you'll be bored again. That's the plan." Danny nodded slowly, considering this promise against the night's evidence, then, in a small deliberate move, let go of his mother's jeans and stepped closer to Alex. Marina's hand twitched as if to stop him, but she held back, watching. "You returned," the boy said simply, with no blame, just acknowledgement of an uncertain fact. "I did," Alex replied, feeling for the first time in years the satisfaction of following through on a difficult, uncertain path, without immediately doubting it or dwelling on what could have gone wrong. "And I'll get you the rest of the way home." Behind him, Frank briskly outlined how many could ride in each vehicle, who would go in the bus to Pinewood, and who would fit in trucks, considering the road might fully close if the hillside gave way. The night was far from over, miles remained, reports needed sending, and skeptical dispatchers had to be convinced that the delay was minor, a near miss. Yet, as Alex stood there, the bus steady under his hand and the tractor idling contentedly, the mist thinning enough to show the pass against the lighter sky, he felt a quiet, steady thread missing for 8 years in acceptance that his risky, imperfect choices, made in darkness and limited information, hadn't destroyed lives, but saved them. The night and its strange tests had restored a part of himself he had nearly forgotten how to hold. As the last passengers settled into beds, couches, and sleeping bags in Pinewood's houses, the eastern sky began to lighten gradually, blurring the line between night and day. The heavy cloud cover over the mountains thinned into layers, allowing some light to filter through and turning the mist in the hollows from gray to faint blue. The bus, now off the road, was pulled onto the widest shoulder near the village, its hazard lights blinking slowly, resembling a stranded ship signaling at an empty sea. The engine was silent, the interior dark, with familiar smells replaced by the scent of home's fried eggs, damp wool blankets, wood smoke, old books. Inside Frank's kitchen, the previously cluttered table with ashtrays, keys, and coffee mugs now displayed an assortment of papers from Alex's driver's bag, a route log, pens, and a disposable coffee cup from a nearby station, its brown stain lit, evidence of recent use. The overhead fluorescent buzzed faintly, casting a harsh flat glow that felt too bright after hours of darkness. Alex sat hunched over the logbook, his injured hand wrapped in clean gauze, as Frank's wife had insisted on changing the old bandage with thoroughness that made him grit his teeth and suppress sounds of discomfort. The fresh dressing was neat and snug, the skin beneath tingling in that oddly reassuring way, signaling healing rather than infection. He held the pen in his left hand, writing slower and more deliberately than usual, with larger letters as if relearning the motion. He noted times, mile markers, and brief event descriptions, compressing hours of fear, mud, wolves, chains, and diesel into plain factual lines understandable to someone unfamiliar with the environment. Departed Hendersonville, 1840, weather rain, light traffic. Reached mile 47 on US 221 around 21:15, observed shoulder failure, right front wheel in subsidence. Passengers stayed on board, driver walked to Pinewood for help. Tractor retrieval began about 2:20, bus removed from slide without injuries or further damage. He listed passenger names from memory and the head count, emphasizing no injuries twice, not officially, but as if planting a stake. The call to his dispatcher matched what he expected and prepared for since the tire dropped. It took 3 tries to connect, as the valley's signal remained spotty despite upgrades. When finally linked, the harried voice turned shrill as Alex summarized the night. "You left the vehicle unattended with passengers," the dispatcher snapped sharply. "You deviated from protocol and involved unauthorized third parties, risking liability. Do you realize everyone is alive?" Alex interrupted softly but confidently. "The bus was off a failed shoulder that could have led to a ravine if we waited for a tow unable to pass the washout. Passengers are safe in houses, warm, uninjured. A child slept through most of it. You can write me up for the rest." There was a brief pause, as if the dispatcher's outrage had hit a wall and needed to regroup. When he spoke again, his tone was thinner and cooler, more about damage control than anger. "Company policy requires an incident report within 24 hours. Remain with the vehicle until a supervisor arrives. Do not relocate it or discuss fault with passengers or media. We will check camera footage and GPS logs. You are suspended from duty during the investigation." Suspended. The word hit him like an old familiar blow, but this time it didn't knock him back. 8 years ago, he had stood in a fluorescent hall and heard a similar phrase implying consequences for doing what believed was right, which emptied him and made him doubt instincts. Tonight, writing in the logbook while the aroma of bread from Frank's wife's proofing dough filled the air, the word felt more like bureaucratic reflex than a verdict, just a flinch at potential lawsuits. He noted it in the margin, suspended pending investigation, hoping handwriting could contain it and keep it from disturbing other truths. The letters appeared smaller, gray, where ink had thinned under his left-handed pressure. "Those city folks don't know their ass from a stump," Frank muttered across the table, nursing his cooling coffee. Having heard enough of the dispatcher's tone through the thin signal, he formed an opinion. If you'd waited for their approved tow and that bus had gone over, they'd suspend you for doing too little. Damn if you do, damned if you don't. The only thing that matters is those people in neighbors' spare beds now. Alex exhaled, almost a laugh. "They need someone to yell at," he said, setting down his pen to stretch his cramped fingers. "I'm convenient. I was there. It's cleaner if blame's on the driver, not the ignored road for 10 years. "You did what you had to," Frank replied, shrugging as mountain men do when the matter's settled. "We were there. The bus was also present." The ground appeared to shift, but we stopped it. That's all. The kitchen door opened, and Marina entered with her hair in a loose knot. She wore a borrowed flannel shirt over her t-shirt, too large at the shoulders and unevenly buttoned over her small frame. Her jeans were damp at the hems, and she was barefoot, her toes curling on the cool linoleum. Behind her, muffled voices and dishes clattering drifted from the living room, where some passengers sat on couches with mugs of tea, others on quilts, creating an atmosphere of exhausted camaraderie. "Danny's out again," she said, leaning on the doorframe, testing the room before fully entering. "He only ate half a sandwich and some cake your wife gave him before collapsing." I had to pry the fork from his hand. Frank's wife, busy at the counter with a pan and dish towel, smiled without looking up. "He's safe here," she said, her hands automatically working, having weathered many crises, births, deaths, outages, and minor dramas of the valley. "All of you are. That's what matters." Marina's eyes moved to the table with the logbook, phone, notes, then to Alex's face. Her gaze was less sharp than on the bus, fatigue replacing adrenaline, evident in her lines and shoulders. Still, her eyes held something searching, as if assessing him beyond the surface, gauging his true nature, now that the crisis eased. "I heard part of that call," she said, without naming which part, but her tight lips indicated the word suspended stuck with her. "They'll really come after you for leaving us there. They'll pursue me for not following a protocol written by people who have never seen that stretch in the rain," he replied, keeping his tone even, unwilling to turn the kitchen into a venue for grievances. "They'll conduct an investigation. They'll review footage, weather reports, and maps. Perhaps they'll see I cost more liability than I gained in goodwill, or maybe not. It's not my decision." "You knew they'd be angry before you went," she said, not asking. "I had a strong suspicion," he admitted. "Didn't change what needed to be done." For a moment, only the soft thump of dough under Frank's wife's hands, the stoves ticking, and the distant house creak filled the quiet as outside temperature shifted. Marina then stepped from the doorframe to the table, stopping by the logbook. She rested her hands on its edge, fingers splayed, knuckles pale. "I was an asshole to you up there," she said, and the bluntness of the word in this kitchen gave it weight that polite phrasing wouldn't. "I sat behind you, criticizing everything, your pace, decisions, silence, thinking I could make the mountain notice me instead of you. When you said you go, I thought." She shook her head, a sharp, angry jerk. "I thought you were running from responsibility. Then you entered that forest." He remembered her standing in the bus doorway, blocking him with her fear, asking if he'd return, and how he gave her less than a promise, since anything more would be a lie. 8 years I've been told that following my instincts leads to bad outcomes," he said softly, more to the table than to her. "Tonight I had to choose whether to listen to that or to my gut, that sitting still would get us all killed. I don't blame you for being angry. You had your kid on that bus, and that kind of fear ignores the driver's psychology." She exhaled softly, almost like a tired laugh. "Fear doesn't care much," she said, "but it recognizes the difference, either panicking and fleeing or feeling scared but doing the hard thing. I've seen both. You're not the first." She reached into the borrowed shirt pocket and gently placed a crumpled foil wrapper on the logbook. He recognized it immediately, the foil Annie used to wrap his sandwich that morning, now crumpled in his bag from earlier. "Your daughter packed that, right?" Marina asked, noticing his quick reaction. "You mentioned before all this that your girl made you a sandwich. I saw you toss the wrapper behind your seat while driving." "I picked it up when the bus lurched, maybe because I thought if something happened, a part of your life should come back to you, even if you didn't intend it." During the bus's initial jolt, her instinct to grasp something as trivial as his sandwich wrapper felt almost painfully tender. He gently picked up the foil, smoothing its creases with his thumb, the metal flashing in the harsh kitchen light. "Her name's Annie," he said. "She's 8. She believes I run the entire world." "She might be right," Marina replied softly with a hint of a smile in her voice, "especially about what truly mattered tonight." They paused briefly in a quiet that reflected shared relief, not exhaustion, as fear's aftereffect created fragile closeness among those who endured it together. Alex folded the foil and tucked it behind his license in his wallet, a small shining token hidden among cards and receipts. He then picked up the pen with his left hand and signed the log. This is where I note that all passengers arrived at alternative accommodations safely, he said, and the part they won't see is everything else. The rest stays here, Frank's wife said, placing a covered dish with a decisive thud. In our minds, in the stories we tell next week and year, companies forget. Mountains don't care. People remember. After filling out forms, drinking coffee, Earl showered off mud and rested briefly before check fences. Hank returned home, looking satisfied and shaken after witnessing something he'd recount at the bar. The house grew quieter as guests, comforted by warmth and food, moved between bathroom, couches, and makeshift beds, their voices softening into a fading murmur and sleep sounds. Alex couldn't lie down yet, his body buzzed with wired fatigue, feeling wrong to close his eyes like leaving a stove on. He stepped onto the porch, quietly closing the door to avoid waking others. Outside, the cold, damp air was less harsh than on the pass, wind dropped, and a steady drizzle replaced the heavy rain like walking through a low cloud. The eastern sky was no longer flat gray, a faint tint of color appeared, a pale pink band at the horizon promising a day different from night. The ridge's outline was sharp against that light, the trees outlined in dark relief like paper cutouts. A rooster crowed prematurely down the road, its hoarse call echoing faintly between houses, and a street lamp flickered twice before shutting off. Its timer convinced sunrise had arrived. Frank leaned against the porch rail, holding a cigarette to shield it from the drizzle. Smoke curled in thin blue threads, blending with the mist, making it hard to distinguish where one ended and the other began. He gestured with the pack as Alex approached. Alex shook his head. He quit years ago, and tonight was not the time to start again. Can't sleep yet, Frank said, not really asking. Feels wrong too, Alex replied, resting his forearms on the damp, cool railing. Like I'd leave before the night finishes its message. Night's said enough, Frank said, flicking ash over the edge. But she might have one more trick, as she often does on nights like this. They stood quietly, listening to the village's hesitant awakening, an engine starting, then stopping, a screen door squeaking, distant sounds of feed being dropped into a barn. The air carried wet earth, smoke, and faint yeast from the rising bread, in the kitchen a warm promise amid the chill. After a few minutes, Frank spoke again, voice softer, as if the topic required a different tone. You came through the woods, not the road, he said. Beyond the slide, the road's worst, guardrails missing, shoulders eroded. I thought I had better chances among trees than in the air. Turns out, the forest had its own ideas. She does, Frank replied, taking a drag and exhaling. He glanced at Alex. Anything up there she hasn't shown the surveyors. Alex thought of the wolves, their reflective eyes in the clearing, the torn ear, rusted collar, and how they blocked his path at hidden drops, and guided him along safer routes, as if the mountain itself had sent them to keep him from danger. He felt tempted to soften the story, to narrate it as a strange dream born of exhaustion and fear, something easier to dismiss before others did. But he remembered Frank's pragmatic acceptance of the land's moods. I saw 5 wolves, he said simply. Almost that, with one larger than the others, torn ear, old collar embedded. They boxed me in at their clearing, blocking some paths, guiding others. Near here, they paused at the trees, watching me enter your yard before retreating into the dark. Frank's cigarette paused midair, ember glowing brighter as he sharply inhaled through his nose. He gazed at the ridge briefly, then nodded, confirming his suspicion. Old Gray, he said. Some call him that. Stories say he's been roaming these hills for nearly 10 years. Large, with a torn ear, and a collar no one has read. Half the valley claims he's just a fed coyote, while others believe he's an angel, demon, or ancient spirit meant to teach lessons. You, Alex asked, curious despite exhaustion, what's your say? Frank shrugged slowly. He's a veteran wolf who knows this land better than any of us. If he didn't attack you when he had the chance, there's a reason. I've heard he's turned hunters from dangerous cliffs and guided a drunken kid back to his dog during a snowstorm. I can't confirm all of it, but I've seen tracks where no two-legged creature would walk unless lost. And I see you on my porch instead of at the bottom of a ravine with your useless phone in hand. Alex left the stories between them, neither dismissing nor inflating them. The shifting wind carried a faint sharp scent reminiscent of wet fur and cold air in an animal's lungs. For a moment, though nonsensical, he felt eyes watching him from beyond the last house, as if ensuring he had come this far. He pushed away from the railing, leaving faint damp prints on his forearms, and stepped down from the porch onto the packed dirt yard. The ground was soft but stable, the rain from last night mostly absorbed by the thirsty earth. The sun had not yet risen above the ridge, but the light was strong enough to make his breath visible in faint puffs that quickly faded in the warming air. Moving toward the lane where Frank's truck was parked its bed now empty of chains, with mud dried into dull streaks, he paused at the tractor's tire tracks curving toward the main road. In the damp earth alongside the ruts, he saw some impressions, most distinct where the soil remained darker, edges crisp before the drizzle softened them. The tracks were paw prints, not from boots or tires, but large oval pads with 4 toe marks and faint claws. They followed the tractor's path for several yards, running parallel as if the creature had paced alongside, silently observing. Alex crouched, his knees aching, and examined one print closely. It was deep, indicating weight, with a stride suggesting a deliberate pace. His bandaged hand throbbed as he steadied himself, the white gauze contrasting with the dark soil. He placed his uninjured palm beside the print, comparing sizes. The paw was larger than his hand. The tracks continued a few more yards, then veered toward the trees, fading as the terrain shifted from earth to leaves, moss, and roots. After a short distance, they vanished into the forest floor's mottled texture, leaving only a faint memory of their path. He straightened gradually, his back creaking, and paused as a cold seeped through his boots. Dawn's first light crept over the ridge, barely touching the trees. The surroundings felt both ordinary, the muddy lane, sagging fences, humble houses, and subtly charged with the night's lingering strangeness, as if reality remained slightly crumpled from rough handling. Behind him, the front door creaked open, and Frank's wife called that breakfast was ready, urging him to come in before the adrenaline wore off, and his body realized how much he'd asked. He turned toward the house, casting a final glance at the fading paw prints near the tractor ruts, feeling not certainty, since that seemed arrogant, but a quiet acceptance of the inexplicable coexisting with the explainable. As he ascended the steps, the wood groaned beneath him, and he entered the warm kitchen, filled with the aroma of bread, bacon, and strong coffee, wrapping him like a blanket. Danny sat at the table, hair tousled, eyes puffy, holding toast with jam on his chin, listening as Karlov, with a mug in hand, gestured to reenact the moment the bus's nose lifted, embellishing his own bravery and downplaying his earlier panic, as survivors often did after near disasters. Old Ruth sat by the window with a contented cat in her lap, her hand stroking its fur. She looked up and gave Alex the same inscrutable nod from the bus, signaling that our unspoken line was complete. Alex poured coffee, the steam rising, and sat down, feeling the warmth in his hands. He realized the tight, cold knot under his sternum from 8 years ago, when doubt and fear dominated his decisions, had loosened overnight. It may never fully go away, scars often remain, but it no longer hindered him, now just a mark of survival and resilience. Outside, the last of the mist lifted slowly over the valley in delicate wisps, as the morning settled in with the persistent quiet of days and places where life endures, regardless of night's struggles. Up on the pass, a county truck would soon arrive to mark the area where the shoulder gave way, placing cones and barriers, while workers in bright vests measured and discussed budgets, mitigation, and future plans. Inside this kitchen, the scene was simpler. 11 people who had counted breaths in darkness now counted bites of toast and sips of coffee. Among them sat a man, exhausted from walking through a forest haunted by ghosts, uncertain of his role in coming weeks, but inwardly realizing the part of him that entered darkness was not the problem. He sipped his bitter coffee, listening as Danny animatedly described the tractor from his limited view, hands gesturing, jam flying in small arcs, his fear transforming into a story he'd someday exaggerate as an adult. Outside, the village trees stood in their usual quiet arrangement, yet now Alex couldn't help but imagine beyond their reach a silent gray shape, moving between the trunks a torn ear, catching the light just long enough to disappear back into shadow, watching over the fragile road that threaded between the harsh demands of the world and what might lurk in the darkness beyond.